Barry Lookaitis was only 14 years old when he walked into Frontier Junior High School in Moses Lake, Washington, on February 2, 1996, carrying a rifle and a handgun. Minutes later, two classmates and a beloved teacher would be dead. The calm, rural town was torn apart in a matter of seconds by a boy many described as quiet, polite, and painfully lonely. What followed became one of the earliest warning signs of a new and terrifying era of school violence in America. Barry grew up in a deeply troubled home. His parents divorced when he was young, and his family life was unstable and emotionally cold. He lived with his father, who struggled with mental health issues and had a volatile temper. Barry was often isolated, bullied at school, and described by classmates as awkward and withdrawn. He had few friends and spent most of his free time alone, escaping into fantasy, violent video games, and dark thoughts. Teachers later said he seemed invisible, not a troublemaker, not popular, just quietly fading into the background. In the weeks before the shooting, several warning signs appeared. Barry reportedly told classmates he wanted to kill himself. He spoke of violence in vague, disturbing ways. Some students even recalled him joking about bringing a gun to school. At the time, in 1996, such statements were not taken with the same urgency they are today. No lockdown drills existed, no active shooter protocols. Small-town schools felt safe. That illusion would be shattered. On the morning of the attack, Barry put on a long black trench coat, packed his father's .30-30 rifle and a .25 caliber handgun, and got on the school bus as usual. Witnesses later said he appeared calm, even expressionless. No one suspected that inside his backpack was enough firepower to change their lives forever. Shortly after classes began, Barry entered his algebra classroom. He stood in front of the room and raised the rifle. Without warning, he opened fire. The first victim was Rebecca "Becky" Wells, a 14-year-old student seated near the front of the class. She was struck and killed almost instantly. Chaos erupted. Students screamed, dove under desks, and ran for the doors. Barry continued firing, shouting phrases later described as eerily detached. One round wounded a student trying to escape. As students fled into the hallway, Barry followed. In another classroom, math teacher Lee Manuel, a 35-year-old father and educator known for his kindness and dedication, rushed toward the sound of gunfire to help students get out. He was shot and killed while trying to protect others. Barry then encountered Aaron Rollin, a 15-year-old student attempting to flee down the hallway. Aaron was shot and fatally wounded. He would die a short time later at the hospital. In just a few minutes, 3 people were dead. Several more were injured. Students hid in closets, classrooms, and bathrooms, certain they were about to die. The school plunged into terror. Police arrived quickly. Barry was found sitting calmly in the hallway with the rifle beside him. He did not resist arrest. Officers later said he appeared eerily relaxed, showing no visible emotion as he was taken into custody. When asked why he did it, he reportedly said, "I did it because I felt like it." The victims left behind devastated families and a shattered community. Becky Wells was remembered as kind-hearted, athletic, and full of youthful energy. Aaron Rollin was described as gentle and well-liked, a boy who loved sports and laughter. Lee Manuel was a dedicated teacher and family man, survived by his wife and children. Their lives were permanently stolen in minutes by someone not even old enough to drive. As investigators searched for a motive, they uncovered a confusing mix of despair, anger, and a craving for attention. Barry had experimented with alcohol, had spoken about suicide, and reportedly admired violent imagery. He later claimed the shooting was meant to be a suicide mission, that he expected police to kill him. When that did not happen, he was left to face the full consequences of what he had done. Because Barry was a minor, public debate immediately erupted. Could a 14-year-old truly understand the weight of murder? Should he be tried as an adult? Was he a monster or an emotionally shattered child left untreated for too long? Prosecutors decided to charge Barry Lukaitis as an adult with multiple counts of aggravated murder. In court, he showed little visible emotion during proceedings. The defense argued that Barry suffered from severe depression and emotional trauma caused by years of neglect and bullying. Psychologists testified that he had suicidal ideation and extreme detachment from reality. The prosecution countered that he planned the attack deliberately, brought weapons from home, and chose his targets intentionally. The trial forced the nation to confront a horrifying reality. A child had become a mass murderer inside a school. In 1997, Barry Lukaitis was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and several weapons charges. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 205 years in prison, with no possibility of release under the laws at the time. The judge stated that while Barry was young, the severity of his crimes left no room for mercy. Families of the victims wept as the sentence was read. Some felt relieved. Others felt conflicted, knowing that a child would die in prison. Over the years, Barry's case became part of ongoing legal debates about juvenile sentencing. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. That decision opened the door for Barry and others like him to seek resentencing. In 2021, after 25 years behind bars, Barry was resentenced. The court acknowledged his youth at the time of the crime, but reaffirmed the extreme brutality of his actions. His revised sentence made him eligible for parole only after serving decades more in prison, meaning he will remain incarcerated well into old age unless future boards decide otherwise. From inside prison, Barry has given a handful of interviews. He has expressed remorse, calling his actions evil and unforgivable. He has admitted he wanted to die that day and now must live with the consequences instead. Some observers believe his remorse is genuine. Others argue that no amount of regret can restore 3 stolen lives. The community of Moses Lake has never fully recovered. Frontier Middle School was later renamed, redesigned, and decades of students grew up under the shadow of what happened there. Survivors of the shooting described decades of trauma, panic attacks, nightmares, and survivors' guilt. Some never returned to classrooms after that day. Others became advocates for school safety and mental health awareness. The tragedy also became one of the earliest reference points for later school shootings across America. Though Columbine would shock the world 3 years later, Moses Lake had already shown what happens when silent suffering, accessible firearms, and warning signs collide. Barry Lukaitis went from an invisible, broken teenager to one of the youngest mass murderers in U.S. history. His story is not just one of rage and bloodshed, but one of systemic failure, a boy who slipped through every crack until violence became his voice. 3 people lost their lives that day simply because they were in the wrong hallway, in the wrong classroom, at the wrong moment. Their families still carry empty chairs at dinner tables decades later. Meanwhile, the boy who ended their lives grows old behind bars, trapped in the moment that defined him forever. This case remains a chilling reminder that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like lonely children sitting quietly in the back of a classroom, unheard, unseen, and already unraveling. Tyler Joseph Hadley was 17 years old when he removed every boundary between teenage rebellion and pure, calculated horror. On July 16, 2011, in the quiet coastal town of Port St. Lucie, Florida, Tyler murdered both of his parents with a claw hammer, hid their bodies in a locked bedroom, cleaned himself up, and then invited dozens of friends over for a party in the same house, while their corpses lay only feet away. This wasn't a crime of panic. It wasn't spontaneous rage. It was premeditated, deliberate, and followed by one of the most disturbing acts of emotional detachment in modern criminal history. Tyler grew up in a middle-class household with his parents, Blake and Mary Jo Hadley. Blake was a police dispatcher, steady and protective. Mary Jo worked in education and was deeply involved in her son's life. By all outward appearances, they were attentive parents. They worried about Tyler's behavior, his grades, his depression, his drug use. They argued with him. They grounded him. They tried to guide him. But Tyler felt trapped. Friends later described him as socially awkward, craving attention, wanting desperately to be accepted. He struggled at school, clashed with authority, and drifted toward marijuana and alcohol. He wanted popularity without discipline. His parents, concerned he was spiraling, recently took away his car and restricted his freedom. To Tyler, these were unbearable humiliations. To his parents, they were desperate attempts to save their son. On the night of July 16th, Tyler planned to throw a house party while his parents were away. But when they said no and insisted they would stay home, something in Tyler snapped. Not explosively, but coldly. He waited until after dinner. According to court records and Tyler's later statements, he retrieved a hammer from the garage and attacked his father first. Blake Hadley never had a chance. Tyler struck him repeatedly in the head and face with such force that the medical examiner later described the injuries as catastrophic. When his mother ran toward the noise, Tyler turned the hammer on her. She tried to flee down the hallway. He chased her and continued striking until she collapsed. In total, investigators estimated over 60 blows were inflicted between the two victims. After the murders, Tyler dragged their bodies into the master bedroom. He placed them on the floor, covered them with blankets, and locked the door. Then he took a shower. He cleaned the blood from his body. He put on fresh clothes. He opened the windows. He sprayed air freshener. He texted his friends, "Party at my house." Within an hour, dozens of teenagers arrived. Music blasted, alcohol flowed, marijuana was everywhere. Kids danced, laughed, and moved freely through the home, including the hallway just outside the locked bedroom where Tyler's parents lay dead. At one point, Tyler even took photos of himself at the party and posted them online. The most disturbing moment came later in the night, when Tyler confided the truth to several close friends. At first, they thought he was joking. When he insisted it was real, they demanded proof. Tyler unlocked the bedroom door and showed them the bodies. Some screamed, some ran. One friend vomited. Instead of calling for help immediately, the group argued among themselves. Some feared getting in trouble for drugs and alcohol. Some didn't believe this could be real. Ultimately, one girl used her phone to text a parent. That parent contacted police. When officers arrived, the party was still ongoing. Teenagers scattered. Police entered the bedroom and discovered the brutally murdered bodies of Blake and Mary Jo Hadley. Tyler was arrested without resistance. At the police station, he waived his rights and confessed in chilling detail. He appeared calm. He described the murders as if recounting a story about someone else. Detectives later said he showed almost no emotional reaction when informed both parents were dead. The medical examiner's report confirmed the horrifying violence. Both victims suffered massive blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with repeated hammer strikes. Neither had meaningful defensive wounds. The attacks were fast, overwhelming, and merciless. Tyler was charged with 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Though only 17, he was tried as an adult under Florida law. As the legal process unfolded, a deeper psychological picture emerged. Tyler had kept a disturbing journal. In it, he wrote about wanting to kill his parents for weeks. He fantasized about hosting the party afterward. He described feeling trapped and wanting freedom at any cost. One journal entry chillingly stated, "I want to see what it feels like to kill someone." Psychologists who evaluated him found traits of antisocial personality disorder, extreme narcissism, impulse control issues, and emotional detachment. There was no evidence of psychosis. He understood exactly what he was doing. The trial began in 2014. Prosecutors painted Tyler as a calculating killer who murdered his parents for nothing more than personal freedom and teenage rebellion. They emphasized the planning, the concealment, and the party as proof of his complete moral collapse. The defense argued that Tyler was emotionally immature, heavily intoxicated by drugs and alcohol at the time, and suffering from long-standing mental instability. They asked the jury to consider a lesser charge that would allow for rehabilitation. But the facts were overwhelming. In 2014, Tyler Hadley was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase that followed became a national conversation about juvenile life sentences. Under Florida law at the time, Tyler faced life without parole. During sentencing, family members of Blake and Mary Jo spoke in court. They described the parents as loving, patient, and desperate to help their son. They spoke of birthdays that would never come, holidays with empty chairs, and the unbearable cruelty of losing both parents at once, at the hands of the child they raised. Tyler addressed the court. He apologized. He said he took full responsibility. He claimed he felt remorse. Some believed him. Others believed it was empty performance. The judge sentenced Tyler Hadley to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In later years, U.S. Supreme Court rulings on juvenile sentencing would again reshape his fate. Life without parole for juveniles was ruled unconstitutional unless carefully justified. Tyler was resentenced in 2019. The court ultimately imposed 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 40 years. He will not be eligible for release until he is nearly 60 years old, and only then if a parole board believes he is no longer a danger. The impact on the Port St. Lucie community was immediate and long-lasting. Parents who once trusted neighborhood gatherings became paranoid. Teen parties vanished. Drug education programs exploded. Trust between children and parents was deeply shaken. Friends who attended the party that night have spoken publicly about the trauma. Many required years of counseling. Several developed substance abuse problems. One described the experience as a mental prison they can't escape. The house was later demolished. Locals said they could no longer look at it without remembering the music playing above two dead bodies. Tyler Hadley's crime remains one of the most disturbing examples of adolescent violence in American history because it exposed something deeply uncomfortable. Not all killers act in rage. Some act in cold pursuit of freedom, pleasure, and attention. Blake and Mary Jo Hadley were not abusive monsters. They were parents trying to stop their son from destroying himself. They removed his car. They said no. For that, they were executed in their own home. Tyler sits in a Florida prison today, aging behind concrete walls he created for himself. He wanted a party. He wanted freedom. What he received instead is a lifetime measured only in steel doors and numbered days. And Port St. Lucie will forever be the town where parents locked a teenager out for his own good and never lived to see the morning. Rodney James Ferrell was only 16 years old when he led a brutal double murder that shocked the United States and exposed just how far fantasy, delusion, and teenage rebellion could spiral into real-world bloodshed. What made the case especially disturbing was not only the savagery of the crime, but the identity Ferrell had created for himself. He claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire named Visago, destined to rule an immortal clan. What began as dark roleplay ended with two innocent parents hacked to death in their own home. Ferrell was born in Kentucky and raised in an unstable environment marked by neglect, emotional volatility, and early behavioral problems. From childhood, he displayed aggressive tendencies, fascination with the occult, violent fantasies, and a growing detachment from reality. By his early teens, he immersed himself in Gothic subculture, blood rituals, online chat rooms, and role-playing games. He drank blood, carved symbols into his skin, and convinced peers that he was not human. Mental health experts later described him as narcissistic, psychopathic, and delusional, but still fully aware of his actions. Online, Ferrell met Heather Wendorf, a 15-year-old girl from Deltona, Florida. Heather came from a deeply religious, strict household. Her parents disapproved of her relationship with Ferrell, whom they saw as a dangerous influence. Heather saw him as powerful, mysterious, and different from anyone she had known. Over months of online communication and phone calls, Ferrell convinced her that he was a vampire and that she belonged to his immortal clan. By late 1996, Heather ran away from home to join Ferrell in Kentucky. Her parents, Naomi and Richard Wendorf, were frantic. Through a series of phone calls, they managed to convince her to come back to Florida, promising they would not press charges. Ferrell agreed to drive her home. That journey sealed their fate. Ferrell traveled with several teenage followers, members of his self-styled vampire clan. Armed with knives and a crowbar, he drove Heather back to Deltona under the guise of reconciliation. But in his mind, Heather's parents were obstacles to his control over her. They had to be removed. On the morning of November 26, 1996, Ferrell and his group arrived at the Wendorf home. Naomi and Richard welcomed Heather back, relieved their daughter had returned safely. They did not know that while they slept, armed teenagers were moving through their house. Ferrell attacked first. Using a crowbar and a knife, he beat and stabbed Naomi Wendorf in her bedroom with extreme force. The medical examiner later counted over 30 stab and blunt force wounds. Her husband Richard confronted Ferrell and was attacked next. He tried to fight back, but was overwhelmed. Both parents died on the floor of their own home, unsure why a stranger had suddenly turned their lives into a nightmare. After the murders, Ferrell calmly walked out and told the others, "It's done." The teenagers stole the family's car, money, and fled the scene. Neighbors soon discovered the bodies and called police. Within hours, the crime made national headlines: a suburban double homicide with runaway teens as the primary suspects. A massive manhunt began. Ferrell, Heather, and the group were tracked across several states. Ultimately, they were captured in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, after a robbery attempt. When police saw Ferrell in custody, many were stunned. He was not some hardened adult criminal. He was a thin, pale 16-year-old boy with a cold stare. During interrogation, Ferrell confessed without remorse. He spoke about being a vampire, about destiny, and about eliminating obstacles. He showed no emotional response when told the Wendorfs were dead. Detectives later testified that he appeared proud. Heather Wendorf, devastated and confused, insisted she never wanted her parents harmed. She claimed she believed Ferrell was going to speak with them, not kill them. Prosecutors disagreed, pointing to planning, weapons, and foreknowledge of violence. While Heather eventually cooperated with investigators, she remained haunted forever by the knowledge that her return home directly led to her parents' deaths. The medical evidence revealed the full horror of the crime. Naomi Wendorf had been beaten so severely that her facial bones were shattered. Richard suffered both blunt force trauma and stab wounds. Either victim likely would have survived had help arrived in time, but the attackers left them to bleed to death. Ferrell was charged as an adult with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because he was a minor, the case opened a fierce national debate. How should the justice system treat juvenile killers who commit crimes usually associated with seasoned murderers? In court, experts testified that Ferrell did not suffer from psychosis. He was not legally insane. He knew right from wrong. He simply believed he was above both. The vampire identity, according to psychiatrists, was not a true hallucination, but a deliberate fantasy reinforced by ego, attention, and power over others. The prosecution presented Ferrell as a charismatic psychopath who manipulated weaker teenagers into following him and committing violence. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, but the brutality and intentionality of the murders left little doubt. In 1997, Rod Ferrell was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to death, making him the youngest person on death row in the United States at the time. The sentence sparked immediate controversy. Many argued that executing someone who was 16 at the time of the crime was inhumane. Others maintained that the savagery of the murders demanded the harshest punishment possible. The victims were mourned quietly but deeply. Naomi and Richard Wendorf were described by friends as loving, generous, and devoted parents who only wanted to protect their daughter. Their home became a symbol not only of violence, but of how quickly evil can enter ordinary suburban life. Years passed. Ferrell sat on death row, becoming a macabre curiosity in American criminal history: the teenage vampire killer. But legal tides shifted. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executing juvenile offenders was unconstitutional. As a result, Ferrell's death sentence was vacated. He was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In prison, Ferrell aged out of his vampire fantasy. In later interviews, he admitted that his identity as Visago was a constructed lie. He described himself as reckless, delusional, and addicted to control. Whether this admission arose from genuine remorse or survival instinct remains debated. Meanwhile, Heather Wendorf carried a different kind of sentence: lifetime guilt. Though she was never charged with the murders, she publicly stated that she blames herself for bringing Ferrell into her family's life. She entered protective custody, changed her name, and vanished from public view. Her life was irrevocably destroyed without a prison cell. The Fox Hollow Farm-style mythology surrounding Ferrell faded, but the core horror remained. 2 parents killed because they loved their daughter enough to bring her home. Rod Ferrell's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of adolescent homicide driven by ideology and delusion rather than impulse alone. It was not a sudden explosion of anger. It was a mission, a role-play fantasy made real with steel and blood. Today, Ferrell remains incarcerated in Florida's prison system, serving life without parole. He will never walk free. The boy who once called himself immortal is growing old behind concrete walls. Naomi and Richard Wendorf were not victims of random crime. They were executed for being parents. And the country learned, in the most brutal way possible, that monsters can wear black trench coats, speak softly, and still walk straight out of a teenager's imagination. On May 21, 1924, Chicago learned a terrifying new truth about evil: that it could wear the faces of privilege, brilliance, and youth. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were not angry outcasts or broken children from the streets. They were wealthy, highly intelligent sons of prominent families, and they committed one of the most infamous murders in American history simply to prove they were superior to everyone else. They called it their perfect crime. Nathan Leopold was a child prodigy. By his early teens, he spoke multiple languages, studied ornithology, and attended the University of Chicago at an age when most boys were still in high school. He was socially awkward, arrogant, and deeply insecure. Richard Loeb, by contrast, was charming, handsome, and manipulative. He was the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan. Together, they formed a toxic partnership built on ego, intellectual vanity, and a shared fascination with Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, the belief that certain superior individuals exist above moral law. To Leopold and Loeb, ordinary people were beneath them. Rules were for the weak. They believed they were destined to commit the ultimate intellectual act, a completely motiveless murder that no one could ever solve. Not for money, not for revenge, not for hatred, for the thrill of it. For months, the 2 young men planned every detail. They discussed victims, methods, disposal of the body, alibis, and ransom schemes. They studied real crimes, crime fiction, and forensic methods. They wanted to outsmart the police, the courts, and society itself. Their victim would be a child, small, vulnerable, quickly subdued. Someone whose disappearance would cause panic, but whose body might never be found. They chose Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy who lived just a few blocks away. Bobby was the son of a wealthy watch manufacturer and the cousin of Richard Loeb. He was bright, polite, and trusting. He had no idea that 2 people he vaguely knew were quietly engineering his death. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1924, Leopold and Loeb rented a car under a false name. Loeb approached Bobby outside his school and offered him a ride, claiming they were going to pick up a tennis racket. Bobby accepted without hesitation. The moment he entered the vehicle, the perfect crime began. Inside the car, Loeb struck Bobby in the head with a chisel. Not once, multiple times. The blows crushed his skull. Bobby never regained consciousness. He was gagged and beaten until he died in the back seat. Leopold drove while Loeb delivered the fatal strikes. 2 teenage geniuses calmly murdered a child in a moving vehicle on the streets of Chicago in broad daylight. They transported Bobby's body to a remote, marshy area near Wolf Lake on the Illinois-Indiana border. There, they stripped him naked, poured hydrochloric acid on his face and genitals to make identification difficult, and shoved his body into a culvert pipe. Then they returned home as if nothing had happened. But they weren't finished. Leopold and Loeb mailed a ransom letter to Bobby's parents, demanding $10,000 and giving elaborate instructions for the money drop. Even though Bobby was already dead, they intended to complete the ransom stage of their game. They watched newspapers eagerly, savoring the panic they had created. The next morning, a railroad worker discovered a young boy's body in a culvert. The wounds were immediately obvious. There was no doubt it was murder. Within hours, the body was identified as Bobby Franks, despite the acid burns. His family was informed before the ransom drop could even take place. Chicago descended into hysteria. Police worked around the clock. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. The Franks family, devastated, assisted fully. One detail immediately stood out: a pair of expensive eyeglasses found near the body. The frames were extremely rare. Investigators traced them to a small number of purchasers in the entire state. One of those purchasers was Nathan Leopold. When questioned, Leopold offered a detailed alibi. He claimed he and Loeb had been driving around looking for girls that night and never encountered Bobby. Loeb confirmed the story. At first, the police had no direct proof to challenge them, but the alibis quickly collapsed. Leopold claimed he lent his car to Loeb that night, yet the chauffeur testified the car was in the garage. The ransom note was typed on a machine traced back to Leopold's home. A park attendant contradicted their timeline. Each lie unraveled another layer of the perfect crime. Finally, confronted with the mounting evidence, both Leopold and Loeb confessed. The public reaction was explosive. The idea that two brilliant, privileged young men had murdered a child for intellectual vanity horrified the nation. Newspapers published daily updates. Crowds gathered outside the jail. Parents across the country feared for their own children. At trial, the prosecution sought the death penalty. The defense hired one of the most famous attorneys in American history, Clarence Darrow, who made the case not about innocence, the boys had already confessed, but about punishment, science, and the psychology of youth. Darrow delivered a legendary 12-hour closing argument, pleading for their lives. He argued that Leopold and Loeb were products of psychological abnormality, upbringing, arrogance, and moral immaturity. He warned that execution would not bring true justice, only more death. The courtroom was silent as he spoke. Even hardened prosecutors were visibly shaken. The judge ultimately spared their lives. In September 1924, Leopold and Loeb were sentenced to life imprisonment plus 99 years for the murder and the kidnapping of Bobby Franks. They would never be eligible for parole at the same time. Society would not kill them, but it would bury them alive behind prison walls. In prison, the two former partners quickly turned on each other. Their alliance collapsed into bitterness, jealousy, and violence. In 1936, Richard Loeb was slashed to death with a razor blade by another inmate in the shower at Stateville Prison. He died at age 30, screaming in a cell block that once echoed with his plans for superiority. Nathan Leopold lived. Leopold became a model prisoner by outward measure. He educated fellow inmates, wrote extensively, and participated in scientific work. Over decades, He expressed remorse and claimed his youthful arrogance had been monstrous self-deception. In 1958, after 33 years in prison, he was granted parole and moved to Puerto Rico. There, he worked as a medical technician. He died in 1971 at age 66. The victim's family never recovered. Bobby Franks was a bright boy with a future that ended in a culvert because two young men wanted to feel intellectually powerful. His parents never accepted the parole of Leopold. To them, the sentence had never been long enough. The case of Leopold and Loeb permanently changed American criminal law. It became foundational in debates about juvenile psychology, capital punishment, and criminal motivation. It shattered the comforting idea that wealth, education, and intellect protect against evil. This was not a crime of desperation. It was not poverty. It was not rage. It was ego. Two young men who believed they were gods discovered, far too late, that they were only human, and that human justice would be relentless. A child was murdered to prove a philosophy, and the perfect crime collapsed under the weight of a single pair of forgotten eyeglasses. On February 12, 1993, the city of Liverpool in England became the center of one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. The murder of James Bulger, a 2-year-old toddler, did not involve an adult predator, a criminal gang, or a tragic accident. It involved two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, children who walked calmly out of a shopping mall with a toddler and led him to his death. This case did not just horrify Britain. It shattered the world's understanding of childhood, innocence, and evil. James Patrick Bulger was a happy, energetic toddler. On that Friday afternoon, his mother, Denise Bulger, took him shopping at the New Strand shopping center in Bootle. He was her youngest child. Like many parents, she looked away for only a moment while handling a purchase. In that brief window of distraction, James disappeared. Security footage later showed James being gently taken by the hand by two older boys. He did not cry. He trusted them. To a toddler, they looked like friends. Those boys were Robert Thompson and John Venables. Both lived in troubled environments. Thompson grew up in severe poverty, with an alcoholic mother and 5 siblings in a violent household. Venables lived in a tense home marked by domestic abuse, instability, and neglect. Teachers had reported disturbing behavior from both boys: aggression, theft, truancy, fascination with violence. But nothing prepared the world for what they would do. Over the next 2 miles, Thompson and Venables led James through streets, across roads, and along railway lines. Dozens of strangers saw them. Some assumed they were brothers. Others thought they were helping a lost child. One woman stopped and asked if James was okay. The boys lied calmly and said he was their brother. Every person who walked past unknowingly passed a death sentence. Eventually, the boys brought James to a remote area beside a railway track. There, the crime escalated from abduction into unimaginable violence. They dropped heavy stones on his head. They kicked him. They threw bricks. Witnesses later testified that James tried to escape, crying for his mother. At one point, he was stomped on. They painted his face with blue paint stolen from a shop. They inserted batteries into his mouth. They beat his body with iron bars and stones. The final blow was delivered by placing James's head on a train rail and striking it with a metal bar. Afterward, Thompson and Venables laid his small body across the railroad tracks, hoping a train would hit him and make his death look like an accident. Then they walked home. Later that evening, a train driver spotted debris on the track. When police arrived, they found the mutilated body of a 2-year-old child. At first, investigators believed the toddler had been struck by a train, but the pattern of injuries told a different story. The extensive blunt force trauma, paint marks, and missing clothing revealed deliberate torture. Britain was thrust into national panic. For 3 days, the country searched for the killer of a baby. Over 1,000 police officers were assigned to the case. Children were kept home from school. Vigil lights filled the streets. Parents held their children tighter. The breakthrough came from the shopping center security cameras. Investigators reviewed hours of grainy footage. There it was, James walking beside 2 older boys, holding hands, being calmly led away. The image became one of the most haunting in criminal history. Police tracked the boys through school records, transit routes, and witness descriptions. On February 14th, Robert Thompson and John Venables were arrested at their homes. Both were 10 years old. During interviews, both initially denied involvement. Then, Thompson confessed. Later, Venables did as well. Each blamed the other for the worst violence, but evidence showed they acted together throughout the entire crime. Medical testimony at trial revealed the full savagery. James suffered 42 separate injuries. His skull had been fractured multiple times. He died not from one blow, but from cumulative trauma. It was deliberate, prolonged, and intentional. In November 1993, Thompson and Venables became the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. The trial was held in adult court. They sat in the dock, looking barely old enough to understand the words being spoken. The jury found both guilty of abduction and murder. The judge sentenced each boy to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, meaning an indeterminate sentence with no fixed release date. The initial minimum term was set at 8 years, but public outrage was overwhelming. Petitions with over 250,000 signatures demanded lifelong imprisonment. In a controversial move, the Home Secretary increased the minimum term to 15 years. The sentence became as political as it was legal. The public reaction was furious, emotional, and divided. Some argued that the boys were irredeemable monsters who should never be released. Others believed they were deeply damaged children, molded by abuse and neglect. The case forced society to ask a terrifying question. Can a child be truly evil or only broken? Psychologists testified that both boys showed signs of conduct disorder, emotional detachment, and desensitization to violence. Yet neither was legally insane. They understood right from wrong. They knew killing James was forbidden. They did it anyway. In 2001, after serving 8 years in secure youth institutions under constant psychiatric supervision, Thompson and Venables were released under new identities into secret locations. Their names, faces, and addresses were protected by court order for life. The decision exploded into controversy. James Bulger's parents were devastated. His mother publicly condemned the release, stating that her son received a life sentence in the ground, while his killers were given a chance to live. She became a lifelong advocate for victims' rights. The most chilling chapter came later. In 2010, John Venables was arrested again, this time for possession and distribution of child abuse material. He was sent back to prison. In 2017, he was convicted again, and his new identity was revoked and permanently reclassified. The judge stated that Venables remained a serious sexual and violent danger to the public. Robert Thompson, by contrast, has never reoffended and lives under lifelong anonymity. His exact location remains unknown. The death of James Bulger changed British law forever. It transformed the way child offenders are treated, how media covers juvenile crime, and how society understands violence at its youngest extremes. The case forced reforms in youth detention, psychological monitoring, and public protection. But no reform repaired what was destroyed. James Bulger was not a symbol. He was a child who loved toy cars and being held by his mother. He fell asleep in a shopping cart and trusted two boys simply because they were older. That trust cost him his life. Thompson and Venables became names synonymous with childhood horror. One appears to have disappeared into quiet anonymity. The other proved, decades later, that the danger never truly left him. This case remains a permanent scar on the modern understanding of violence. It stands as proof that evil does not always arrive in adult form. Sometimes it walks beside you in a school uniform, holding the hand of a toddler on a normal shopping day that ends in the unthinkable. In the quiet neighborhoods of Warwick, Rhode Island, during the late 1980s, parents worried about curfews, school grades, and the usual small-town troubles. What they did not fear was a 13-year-old boy with a knife, moving silently through unlocked doors at night, hunting people in their sleep. No one imagined that the most dangerous killer in the city was still in middle school. His name was Craig Chandler Price. Between the ages of 13 and 15, Price murdered 4 people, broke into dozens of homes, and terrorized an entire community. He would become one of the youngest and most chilling serial killers in American history, not because of chaos or impulsivity, but because of how calm, methodical, and utterly fearless he was. Price was born in 1975. From early childhood, he displayed extreme behavioral problems. Teachers described him as aggressive, hostile, and remorseless. He bullied classmates, stole constantly, vandalized property, and showed an obsession with weapons and violence. At home, he was uncontrollable. His family tried discipline, counseling, and medication. Nothing worked. By age 12, Craig Price was already breaking into homes permanently barred from him by the court. By 13, he had escalated to murder. The first killing occurred on July 27, 1987. That night, Price broke into the home of 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, a woman who lived alone. Armed with a kitchen knife, he entered her bedroom while she slept. He stabbed her more than 50 times. The brutality shocked detectives. The wounds were deep, frenzied, and deliberate. There was no sign of sexual assault. Nothing was stolen. Rebecca had been targeted simply because she was there. For police, the homicide made no sense. There was no motive, no suspects, no prior connection between attacker and victim. The city was stunned. Then, 3 months later, it happened again. On October 1st, 1987, Price broke into another home. This time, he murdered an entire family. Helen Pien, 39, and her 2 daughters, Jennifer, 10, and Evelyn, 8. Like Rebecca Spencer, they were asleep. Price stabbed all 3 to death in their beds. 3 murders in less than 4 months. No forced entry, no theft, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Warwick descended into fear. Parents armed themselves. Neighbors slept with lights on. Lock sales exploded. Police patrols doubled overnight. The idea that a killer was slipping silently into homes at night created a level of terror usually reserved for large cities, not suburban Rhode Island. Yet no one suspected a child. Craig Price returned to normal life the next morning after each killing. He went to school. He laughed with friends. He returned homework assignments. He played video games. He blended in with horrifying ease. Then, in 1988, a break finally came. By accident. Price was arrested for burglary after being caught breaking into a home. During questioning, police searched his bedroom and found an alarming collection. Weapons, burglary tools, violent drawings, and notebooks filled with disturbing fantasies of stabbing people in their sleep. Still, this alone was not enough to connect him conclusively to the murders. But detectives had grown suspicious. They began comparing shoe prints. The match was exact. In July 1988, Craig Price was arrested for the murders of Rebecca Spencer and the Pien family. During interrogation, he confessed with chilling ease. He showed no fear, no remorse, and no emotional reaction. He calmly walked investigators through each killing as if giving directions to a store. There was no rage in his voice, only precision. Psychologists were brought in immediately. Their conclusions were terrifying. Craig Price showed severe antisocial personality traits, extreme callousness, lack of empathy, and an advanced level of emotional detachment, usually seen in adult psychopaths. One expert testified that Price felt excitement during the murders, not anger, not revenge, but pleasure. Yet the law had limits. Because Price was only 13 at the time of the first murder and 15 at arrest, he could not be tried as an adult for the original killings. Under Rhode Island juvenile law, the maximum sentence he could receive was until age 21. The families of the victims were outraged. In 1989, Craig Price pleaded guilty in family court to 3 counts of first-degree murder and related burglary charges. He received the maximum juvenile sentence, confinement until his 21st birthday, for killing 4 people. Many believed he would be released, still dangerous and still young. While incarcerated at the Rhode Island Training School for Youth, Price only confirmed their fears. He attacked guards. He stabbed another inmate. He was found hoarding homemade weapons. He routinely threatened staff, openly bragging about his murders. He once told a guard he would kill again the moment he was released. Psychological evaluations repeatedly classified him as extremely high risk. Then, just 6 months before his 21st birthday, months before his automatic release, Craig Price committed his 4th known murder. On October 4th, 1989, inside the juvenile detention facility, Price strangled Eric Apuzzo, a 19-year-old inmate, with a cord. Apuzzo never stood a chance. Price killed him calmly in a bathroom, then returned to his cell as if nothing had happened. This time, there was no legal shield. Now 15 years old at the time of this killing, Price was eligible to be tried as an adult. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, and he was convicted in adult court. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For the first time, the public exhaled. Craig Price would not be released at 21. Still, even behind adult prison walls, Price remained dangerous. Over the years, he stabbed fellow inmates, assaulted guards, and was repeatedly placed in solitary confinement. His disciplinary record became one of the worst in the state prison system. Correctional officers testified that Price remained cold, manipulative, and completely unrepentant. In interviews with psychologists, Price described his childhood murders with clinical detachment. He did not blame abuse, trauma, or mental illness. He admitted he killed because he wanted to. He enjoyed the sense of power. He enjoyed entering homes and watching people die. There was no hidden motive, no family revenge, no sexual fixation, only dominance. The victims were ordinary people. Rebecca Spencer was a young woman starting her adult life. She worked hard, had friends, and lived alone in what she believed was a safe neighborhood. Helen Pien was a devoted mother raising 2 children. Jennifer and Evelyn were elementary school students, known for their kindness and love of school. Their father found their bodies after returning home from work. The trauma destroyed him. He later spoke of living with permanent psychological scars. Eric Apuzzo, the 4th victim, was a troubled teenager with his own legal issues, but he was trying to rebuild his life. He never walked out of the detention facility alive. 4 lives ended by a boy who never once showed regret. As of today, Craig Price remains in prison, classified as a violent career offender with a long history of institutional assaults. Any consideration of parole has been delayed repeatedly due to continued dangerous behavior. Mental health experts agree that he represents a permanent threat to public safety. The Craig Price case changed juvenile justice in Rhode Island. Laws were revised to allow for harsher adult sentencing when juveniles commit extreme violent crimes. Risk assessment procedures in youth detention facilities were permanently restructured. The illusion that childhood automatically equals innocence was shattered. This case left law enforcement with a deeply uncomfortable truth. Some killers do not become monsters. They are already monsters when they are still supposed to be children. Craig Price never needed a gang, drugs, ideology, or rage. He needed only unlocked doors and sleeping victims. He once told a prison psychologist that the scariest part of his crimes was not the blood, it was how easy it was. No resistance, no planning failures, no guilt afterward. Just silence, and then home for dinner. The city of Warwick still remembers those nights. Even decades later, some families still double-lock doors, not because crime is high, but because once a child killer walked freely through their streets. Long before Carroll Edward Cole became one of America's most prolific serial killers, long before police files labeled him a predator of women and a roaming murderer across the country, he was already a killer at 9 years old. That fact alone places him in a category so rare and disturbing that even veteran criminologists struggle to explain it. Most serial killers begin in adolescence or early adulthood. Cole began before he reached double digits. He was born in 1938 in Sioux City, Iowa, into a family defined by violence, instability, and alcoholism. His father was abusive and absent. His mother was emotionally detached and violent herself, openly expressing hatred toward men and abusing her children. From an early age, Carroll was surrounded by cruelty as a normal part of life. There was no sense of safety, no moral guidance, only fear and rage. According to later psychological evaluations, Cole showed signs of extreme behavioral disturbance almost immediately. He tortured animals, stole compulsively, assaulted other children, and showed no remorse. Teachers reported him as emotionally vacant and dangerously aggressive. By age 9, he had developed an intense hatred of women, a belief seeded by years of abuse and his mother's repeated statements that men were worthless and violent. In 1947, when Carroll was 9 years old, he committed his first murder. The victim was a young female classmate, a girl he had known casually through school. He lured her to a secluded area and strangled her to death. The killing was quiet, personal, and deliberate. No one ever suspected a child. The death was dismissed as an accident. There was no arrest, no investigation that reached the right person. Carroll returned home and never spoke of it. But he later would. As he grew older, the violence inside him did not fade. It evolved. In adolescence, he began committing sexual assaults. By his late teens, he was attacking women and killing them when he believed they were sexually impure. He developed a twisted internal code. He would punish women he believed did not live up to his idea of morality. In reality, it was an excuse to kill without confronting his own hatred. His confirmed adult murder spree began in Texas in 1965, when Cole was 27. He strangled a woman to death in a vacant building. He was caught quickly and sentenced to prison. During interrogation, he confessed not only to that murder, but also claimed he had killed before. Detectives dismissed his childhood confession as fantasy. It was not fantasy. Over the next 2 decades, Carroll Cole would drift across the United States, from California to Nevada, Texas, Colorado, and back again, killing women as he moved. He targeted primarily prostitutes, homeless women, and women he met in bars. He strangled them with his hands, belts, cords, whatever was available. The weapon did not matter. Control did. Between 1965 and 1980, Cole was in and out of prison repeatedly for violent assaults and murders. Each time, he was somehow released, through plea deals, reduced sentences, or parole boards that believed he could be rehabilitated. Each time, he killed again. By his own later confession, Carroll Cole murdered at least 35 women. Investigators were only able to fully verify 5, but many experts believe his number is significantly higher. In California, he strangled multiple women in bar restrooms and abandoned buildings. In Texas, he killed again shortly after parole. In Colorado, another woman disappeared after being seen with him. His pattern was consistent: brief interaction, isolation, strangulation, body abandonment. What makes his case uniquely horrifying is not only the scale, but the psychological consistency. Cole was aware of what he was. He once told a prison psychiatrist, "I have this sickness. When I'm free, I feel it growing. When I kill, it goes away for a while." Unlike many serial killers who disguise their urges, Cole openly admitted that prison was the only environment where he felt safe from himself. Yet the system repeatedly released him anyway. In 1973, while imprisoned in Nevada for murder, Cole was evaluated by state psychiatrists who concluded he was mentally competent and could control his impulses with treatment. He served a relatively short sentence. Within months of release, he killed again. In 1979, he murdered 35-year-old prostitute Wilma McCoy in Colorado. Again, he was caught. Again, he confessed. Again, he spoke openly of his compulsion to kill. This time, prosecutors sought a harsher sentence. He was convicted and sent to prison in Nevada State Prison. Then, in 1984, Carroll Edward Cole died, not by execution, but by his own hand. At age 46, he was found dead in his prison cell after suffocating himself with a plastic bag. Only after his death did the full truth finally emerge. During extensive post-case reviews, prison psychologists re-examined decades of interviews. One written confession stood out: his claim that his first murder happened when he was 9. Investigators quietly reopened cold case records from Iowa. A missing child from the same area and time frame matched his description. Forensic confirmation was limited due to the age of the case, but law enforcement ultimately concluded that Cole's childhood confession was credible. He was not exaggerating. He was one of the youngest documented killers in American history. The implications were chilling. Carroll Cole was not shaped into a killer during his teenage years. He crossed that line in elementary school. He did homework by day and strangled a classmate by night. The idea that a child that young could carry out a murder with intent shattered every assumption about violent development. Victim after victim faded into statistics, but each was a real life. One woman was a runaway trying to survive on the streets. Another worked late shifts and accepted a ride that became her death sentence. Some were never even identified. Their names were lost long before justice could find them. Families waited years without answers. Some never received remains to bury. Cole justified his murders as moral punishment, but investigators later concluded his victims had nothing in common beyond vulnerability. The code he spoke of was only a narrative he used to rationalize killing. The real motive was dominance, control, and release. Psychologists studying his case describe him as a rare example of early-onset sadistic psychopathy, a disorder so severe that it manifests before adolescence and persists without remission. Unlike many killers who develop through trauma triggers later in life, Cole's violent identity appears to have formed almost fully before his teenage years. There were countless missed opportunities to stop him sooner. He was arrested multiple times as a juvenile for violent assaults. He openly talked about killing while incarcerated as an adult and was still released. Parole boards knew his history. Doctors warned of recurrence. Yet the system treated each murder as an isolated offense, not as a pattern. By the time Carroll Cole died in his cell, he had spent more of his life in prison than outside it. Still, that was enough time to leave a trail of bodies across the country. His case remains a grim lesson still studied today. Some predators begin far earlier than anyone imagines, and waiting for them to mature out of violence can be fatal. The idea that a 9-year-old could commit murder, feel no remorse, grow into a serial killer, repeatedly confess his danger, and still be released again and again, it forces law enforcement and psychology to confront a terrifying possibility. Sometimes the warning signs are not subtle. Sometimes they are screaming. And sometimes society chooses not to listen.